What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Minnesota Golden Gophers are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Minnesota did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Minnesota. My projection for this team was 7-5, and then my prediction for them was 8-4. So Minnesota did about what I expected them to do, going 7-5 in the regular season. I was wrong on their prediction, but I was right on their projection. So we were kind of expecting Minnesota to be right there around 6, 7, 8 wins, somewhere in that particular win range, because this is one of the more consistent programs in the Big Ten. They had a disappointing year in 2023, but it was definitely a better season compared to 2023. They went 7-5 in 2024, but if you count their bowl game win at the end of the year, this team went 8-5 overall, so a pretty solid season for Minnesota and a decent season for the Golden Gophers. You look at the schedule from last year for Minnesota. First off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They, of course, had to play North Carolina out of the ACC. They lost that game by like 2 points. So, yeah, that was a tough loss there to open up the season there on August the 29th. But then they also had Rhode Island and Nevada, so not a tough non-conference schedule for the Golden Gophers. And then you take a look at the Big Ten schedule. First off, you look at who they played at home. They played Iowa, USC, Maryland, Penn State. So they had 4 home games in the Big Ten last year, and then you look at their road games. They had to play 5 road games in the Big Ten. They played at Michigan, at UCLA, at Rutgers, and Penn State. So their losses in the Big Ten came to Iowa at home. Yeah, they did a really nice job at home last year in the Big Ten, but they also had that other loss to North Carolina at home. But other than that, they did a pretty good job in their home games. Their road games, though, they lost to Michigan and Rutgers. Those were pretty tough losses there, and then obviously Penn State. They lost that game by 1 point. If they would have probably won that game, that probably would have ruined Penn State's playoff chances. So they came really close to last year beating the Nittany Lions, but that was the schedule from last year. What does it look like for 2025 for Minnesota? This is the schedule coming up here for the Golden Gophers. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Minnesota plays in the non-conference for this season. So you look at this non-conference schedule. They will play Buffalo, Northwestern State, and on the road at California. So a couple of cupcake games here. Buffalo out of the MAC, and then you got an FCS team in Northwestern State. Then you got to go on the road to play Cal. So you have to go out west here for this game, which I think it could be a pretty tricky game here. So this will be a pretty interesting non-conference game. And California, of course, out of the ACC. So this is now 3 years in a row that Minnesota is playing an ACC team out of the non-conference. But I think that should be a pretty exciting game. We'll see what happens there. And they do play that game, I believe, in week 3. So yeah, that's your non-conference schedule. Not so tough whatsoever. We now go to the home schedule in the Big Ten. They will play 5 home games this time at home in the Big Ten. They'll play Rutgers, Purdue, Nebraska, Michigan State, and Wisconsin. All very winnable games here for Minnesota. These are all games that look like they're pretty even matchups. You know, they might be favored against Purdue and Michigan State, but Rutgers, Nebraska, and Wisconsin going to be tricky games at home. But when I look at this home schedule, they're all very winnable games here for Minnesota. Some of these games could go either way, and then some of them, the Golden Gophers, they might be favored in some of these games. But yeah, home schedule, not too bad for them. Let's now go to the away schedule. The away schedule is very tough. They'll play on the road at Ohio State, at Iowa, at Oregon, and at Northwestern. So Northwestern is a pretty winnable game, but you got Oregon, Iowa, and Ohio State. 3 tough places to play. Ohio State and Oregon are definitely going to be the toughest here. They might be big underdogs in both of those games, and then Iowa could be a pretty even matchup. And I did Iowa's projection here from last Friday, so you might know what Minnesota's game against Iowa is going to look like. But yeah, when I look at this road schedule, it's definitely tougher than the home schedule. I mean, like I said, all home games in the Big Ten this year for Minnesota are pretty winnable, but the away schedule, they might be big underdogs against the Ducks and the Buckeyes, but Northwestern, a winnable game on the road. Maybe same thing with Iowa, because they did lose to them last year at home, so that could be a pretty exciting matchup there. So that's your away schedule. Let's go back to the schedule now and go game by game now for Minnesota. They open things up on a Thursday night on August 28th. They'll play Buffalo first, and then they play Northwestern State after that on September the 6th. Then they go on the road to play California on September 13th. So there's a really good chance that Minnesota starts 2-1 or 3-0, depending on what happens in that California game. But they do play all three of their non-conference opponents in the first 3 weeks. Then after that, they get their first bye week before playing Big Ten opponent Rutgers. They open up Big Ten play against the Scarlet Knights on September 27th. Then they go on the road to play Ohio State on October the 4th. Then it's back at home for Purdue on October the 11th. Nebraska also at home on October the 18th, and then it's back on the road at Iowa on October 25th. Then they come back home to play Michigan State on November 1st, and then it's on the road at Oregon. They get a bye week before playing the Ducks here, which I think is a really good spot for a bye week because you don't get another bye week until that, stretch there in the month of November. So yeah, I like the spot here for this bye week against the Ducks. They play them on November 15th, and then they also play Northwestern on the road. So you got back-to-back road games there with Oregon and Northwestern, the only back-to-back road game trip here on the schedule. And then they close things out to play rival Wisconsin on November 29th. So that is the schedule for Minnesota for 2025. And just looking at this schedule, it is pretty tough. I'm not going to lie, it's a pretty tough schedule. Again, you got Ohio State and Oregon both on the road. You got Iowa on the road, but again, just looking at this home schedule, a lot of very winnable games here for Minnesota. And again, we expect Minnesota to be right there around 6, 7, 8 wins, somewhere in that win range. And then also at best, they can probably get to 9 wins as well. But let's get a projection here for Minnesota and find out what their record could be, or maybe their projected record could be in 2025. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection. If it's a 1% game in the red, that's pretty much counted as an automatic loss. 20% games in the orange, they'll be double-digit underdogs in that percentage. 40% games in the yellow, those are games where Minnesota will be about a clear underdog in by about a touchdown, 6 or 7 points. And then your 50-50 games will stay in the white. Those are games that really can go either way in that percentage. 60% games in the purple, that's a percentage that Minnesota will be favored by 6 or 7 points. And then your 80% games in the blue, those are games where Minnesota will be favored by double digits. And then your 99% games in the green, those are pretty much your automatic wins. So we'll start with that percentage here first. The easy wins for Minnesota, I think you got a couple of them. That's Buffalo and Northwestern State. Yeah, Minnesota definitely should be able to take care of business. Again, they got Buffalo here on a Thursday night. We've seen some upsets here on these weeknight games, but that's mostly in the ACC conference. We don't really see it a lot in the Big Ten. So yeah, Minnesota definitely should be able to take care of business, but you never know. Buffalo is a pretty good group of 5 team out of the MAC. They could be a decent team this year, and maybe this game probably is at that 90 to 94% range. But as of right now, I think that game is definitely over that 95 to 99% range. And then same thing with Northwestern State. Now, they might be favored against Northwestern State by 20 plus or even more than that, or they could be, against Buffalo. They could probably only be favored by 17 or just 20, just inside that 20-point range. But these are not guaranteed wins, let's just put it that way. These are pretty much counted as automatic wins, and they should be able to take care of business in them. But you never know. We've seen some Power 4 teams get upsetted by these Group of 5 teams and then also these FCS teams. But I expect Minnesota to row in both of these games. And then we got one game here where I think Minnesota is going to be favored by double digits, and that's going to be Purdue out of the Big Ten. The reason why it turns into a blue game is because Minnesota is playing at home. Obviously, the Boilermakers don't know how good this team is going to be. They have a new head coach. They might be improved some because they have the UNLV's former head coach and everything, so maybe they're a little bit better this year. But I think Purdue, just based off of where they were last year, yeah, this was one of the worst teams in the Big Ten, so they definitely should be able to take care of business as well. And I think Minnesota will be favored by double digits, like 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that point range. And then I got one game in the purple as well, and that's going to be Michigan State. I think Minnesota will be favored by about a touchdown against the Spartans. Michigan State could be a lot better this year. If this game was on the road for Minnesota, it would definitely be in the white. But I'm going to stick with it here and put it in the purple just because it's a home game here for the Golden Gophers. So yeah, that one game there against Michigan State, I think Minnesota will be favored in this this one by 6 or 7 points. And then we go to the games where I think Minnesota is going to be about an underdog in. I don't have any red games on here, but I do have a couple of games in the orange, and those are going to be the two games on the road, Ohio State and Oregon. I think Minnesota will be double-digit underdogs against the Buckeyes and the Ducks. There's really not a big chance that they probably pull off, one of these two upsets here in the orange, but never say never. We've seen a lot of, decent teams and some solid teams upset some talented teams over the course of the years on the road, but I just don't think Minnesota has a chance in these two games at all. Ohio State and Oregon are just way too more talented than Minnesota is, and Ohio State, obviously, because it's on the road, that's the reason why it turns into an orange game, and then same thing for Oregon. Both of these teams are going to be very talented, and these are going to be really two tough games on the road. So yeah, Minnesota will be definitely clearly double-digit underdogs, again by 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that point range. And then I got 6 total 50-50 games on here for Minnesota. California on the road, Rutgers, Nebraska, then Iowa on the road, Northwestern also on the road, and then you got Wisconsin. Now, you can make an argument that Wisconsin definitely should be in the purple, and maybe Rutgers also should be in the purple as well, but I'm going to put those as 50-50 games for right now. Rutgers was a pretty decent team last year, and I think Minnesota and Rutgers are definitely in that same tier as talented teams in the Big Ten. Minnesota might be the more well-coached team, but I'm telling you, Rutgers, the Scarlet Knights are heading in the right direction as a program. They've been good for the last 2 years. Nebraska, that looks like a pretty even matchup. Same thing with Wisconsin. It's always a pretty even matchup between the Badgers and the Golden Gophers. I know Minnesota beat, Wisconsin on the road last year pretty easily, but I'm going to put that in the white for right now. California pretty much is a road game. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. And then Iowa, I think that's a game that really can go either way as well. The reason why that's a 50-50 game is because Iowa beat Minnesota on the road last year. And then Northwestern, I know Northwestern was not really good last year. This is a game that should be in the purple, but I'm going to put it in the white for right now just because it's on the road. And I think they're going to split these 50-50 games as well. They might win 3 out of the 6, but that gives you my projected record here for Minnesota. Again, we count the green games as a win, and then also the one blue game against Purdue as a win as well. Then you average out that one purple game against Michigan State at 60%. Then average out, or actually we count these 2 orange games as losses, and then we also split these 50-50 games. We average them out at 50%. Like I said, I think they'll split these 50-50 games. They win 3 out of the 6. That's going to give you a total of 3 more wins, and then also count the one blue game and also the green games. That's going to give you a total of 7 wins. So 7-5 is what the projection comes out to be here for Minnesota. I think that's a pretty fair projection. Again, we expect Minnesota to be right there around 6, 7, 8 wins, somewhere in that win range. Pretty much this is one of the more consistent teams and programs in the Big Ten. I think best case probably 8-4, worst case 6-6, and then also another worst case is probably like 5-7, and not making it to a bowl game. If they go 5-7 this year with this kind of tough schedule, I mean, it could be probably a disappointing year, but they can do better. If they can do better than 7-5 and 8-4 and go 9-3 or 10-2, Minnesota becomes a real contender in the Big Ten. But I think 7-5 is a fair projection based on how tough this schedule is. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And also give me your thoughts about Minnesota's schedule down in the comments below. Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.